623 years, 36 men, one family. And by the time it was over, the last of them was sitting in a rented house in Italy, owing money he could not pay. Today I'm ranking every Ottoman Sultan from S to F, and I'll tell you now. The man who built the empire's greatest century and the man who lost the whole thing were separated by only 10 generations of the same bloodline. Before we start, a few ground rules, because a tier list with no rules is just a mood. Rule 1. I'm ranking reigns, not personalities. Some of these men were, by every account we have, decent human beings who happened to preside over disasters. Some were monsters who happened to preside over golden ages. The tier is what happened to the state while they held it, and I'll tell you separately what I think of the man Rule 2. And this one I'm borrowing from how I look at every fallen dynasty on this channel. If a full civil war breaks out on your watch, you do not go higher than D. Doesn't matter how brilliant you were before it started. A dynasty that turns its army on itself is a dynasty that has already begun dying, and the Sultan holding the seal at that moment owns it. Rule 3, I have a category outside the tiers entirely, and I'm calling it NA. These are the contested ones, the ones who never really ruled, the ones who were held in a locked room for most of their lives, and then put on a throne for a matter of weeks. Ranking them would be like ranking a man for a race he was carried through. That category includes the princes of the Civil War years, Mustafa I, Murad V, and one more name at the very end of this video that a lot of people assume was a sultan and technically never was. Keep that one in the back of your mind, because that name is where this entire story actually ends. Let's start at the beginning. Osman I, the man the whole dynasty is named after. Osman, Osman, Ottoman. He starts as the leader of a small frontier principality in northwestern Anatolia around the year 1299. In the wreckage left behind when the Seljuk order in Anatolia collapsed and the Mongols reshaped the region. There were dozens of these little Turkish beyliks. Statistically, Osman's should have been swallowed like the rest of them. Instead, he pushed steadily into Byzantine Bithynia, won a real field victory at Baphius in 1302 against a Byzantine force, and built a war band with a reputation strong enough that fighters came to him instead of his rivals. He died around 1323 or 1324, right as his people were closing on the city of Bursa. I'm putting him in A, not S, and here's my reasoning. The empire that everyone pictures when they hear the word Ottoman did not exist in Osman's lifetime. What he built was a frontier state with momentum. But momentum is the hardest thing in the world to create from nothing, and every single man after him inherited it from him. A tier, Orhan. Osman's son, and the man who turned a raiding principality into an actual government. Bursa falls in 1326 and becomes a capital. Iznik in 1331. Izmit in 1337, he starts minting coins, which sounds boring and is actually one of the loudest statements a medieval ruler can make. It says, I am a state now, not a chieftain. Then comes the move that changes European history. The Byzantine Empire is tearing itself apart in its own civil war, and one of the claimants, John VI Cantacuzene, hires Orhan's men as allies and gives him his daughter Theodora in marriage. The Ottomans cross into Thrace as invited guests, and they never leave. By the 1350s they hold Gallipoli and have a permanent foothold in Europe. I'm putting Orhan in A as well. He didn't just expand, he changed the category of thing the Ottomans were. Murad I, and this is the first genuinely hard call of the list. Murad takes Adrianople, Edirne, and moves the center of gravity of the whole enterprise into Europe. He turns Serbia and Bulgaria into vassals. He is the ruler under whom the structures that would define the empire for centuries begin taking shape, including the standing infantry corps that would become the Janissaries and the child levy system that fed it. And in 1389 he wins the Battle of Kosovo against a Balkan coalition and dies on that field, the only Ottoman Sultan ever killed in battle. I know some of you are already typing that he's S tier, and I understand it. He is, in terms of institution building, arguably the most consequential man in the first century of the dynasty, but I'm keeping S extremely tight on this list, and I'm putting Murad I in a high A, the top of a Bayezid I lightning. Yildirim, and this is where my second rule does its first real damage. Bayezid is genuinely one of the most talented battlefield commanders the family ever produced. He crushes a crusading army at Nicopolis in 1396. He blockades Constantinople. He moves so fast his enemies could not track him. And then in 1402 he faces Timur at Ankara. His Anatolian vassals defect on the field, and he is captured. He dies in Timur's custody the following year, and the empire fractures into a civil war between his sons that lasts 11 years. 11 years where there is no Ottoman state, only Ottoman claimants. I'm putting Bayezid I in D. He nearly ended the dynasty in its second century by overreaching, and everything his great-grandfather and grandfather built came within one battle of vanishing from history entirely. Talent doesn't save you from the rule. The sons who fought that war, Suleiman Chalabi, Musa Chalabi, Isa Chalabi, and later Mustafa Chalabi, all go in NA. They held territory, they minted coins, some historians count them. I don't count them as sultans of a unified empire because there wasn't one. Mehmed I, the son who wins that war and stitches the empire back together. He puts down the Sheikh Bedreddin revolt, restores central authority, and hands his son a functioning state instead of a corpse. Historically, he's called the second founder, and that's fair. I'm putting him in B. He rebuilt rather than expanded, and rebuilding after your father's catastrophe is genuinely heroic work, but it's recovery, not growth. Murad II fights the Crusade of Varna in 1444 and wins it. Wins at Kosovo again in 1448, failed at Constantinople in 1422, which is worth noting, and here's the strange detail people forget. He actually abdicated, tried to retire, and had to be pulled back onto the throne because the state couldn't function without him. He's a tier, he stabilized the borders, and more importantly, he raised and trained the man who's about to break the tier list, Mehmed II, S tier. And I don't think this one is close. He becomes sultan for the second time at 21, and immediately does the thing that everyone for 800 years had failed to do. In 1453, he takes Constantinople, the Roman Empire, and that is what the Byzantines were. The direct continuous eastern half of it ends on the 29th of May, 1453, and a 21-year-old ends it. He doesn't stop there. Serbia, the Morea, Trebizond, Bosnia. Crimea brought under Ottoman overlordship. His forces land at Otranto in Italy in 1480. He rebuilds Constantinople as Istanbul, resettles it deliberately with Muslims, Christians, and Jews, restores the Patriarchate under Ottoman authority, and issues law codes that shaped the empire's administration for centuries. He also formalized in law the practice of a new sultan executing his brothers, and I want to sit on that for 1 second, because it's not a footnote. That single policy is the seed of almost everything that goes wrong 300 years later, and I'll come back to it. S tier, the single most consequential reign in the family's history. Bayezid II. Follows the Conqueror, which is the worst job in any dynasty. He consolidates. He rebuilds the navy. He's the sultan who sends ships to bring Sephardic Jews expelled from Spain in 1492 into Ottoman territory. And that's a genuinely remarkable act of statecraft as well as of mercy. He got skilled populations and they got to live. He also spends years managing the fact that his brother Sem was in European custody as a permanent political weapon that could be aimed at him. And at the end, his own son forced him off the throne, and he died within weeks. C tier, steady unspectacular, ended badly. Sem, by the way, N.A., claimant who spent his life as a hostage in Europe. Tragic figure, never ruled. Selim I, 8 years on the throne. 8. And in those 8 years he defeats the Safavids at Calderon in 1514, then turns south and destroys the Mamluk Sultanate at Marj Dabik and Ridania in 1516 and 1517, adding Syria, Egypt, and the Hejaz. He roughly doubles the size of the empire, and he brings the guardianship of Mecca and Medina under Ottoman authority, the foundation of the Ottoman claim to the caliphate that will matter enormously at the end of this video. I'm putting him in S, and I want to be honest about what that means, because Selim's byname in the West is the Grim, and he earned it. His reign was violent even by the standards of his own time, including toward his own officials and his own family. I'm ranking the reign. The reign is S. Suleiman I, the magnificent to Europe, the lawgiver to his own people, and both names are accurate. S tier, Belgrade in 1521, Rhodes in 1522, Mohacs in 1526, where the Hungarian kingdom effectively ends in an afternoon. Vienna in 1529, where he fails, and that failure matters. It's the high watermark of the Western push. His Admiral Barbarossa wins at Preveza in 1538, and the Mediterranean becomes an Ottoman lake for a generation. At home, he systematizes the legal code, and his architect Mimar Sinan builds mosques that people fly across the world to look at 5 centuries later. He is also the man who had his own gifted eldest son Mustafa executed on suspicion of treason, and had his closest friend and Grand Vizier Ibrahim executed as well. He died on campaign in Hungary in 1566, and his death was concealed from the army for days so the siege wouldn't collapse. S tier, easily. And the last one on this list, because from here something changes. And I want you to watch for it, because this is the pattern that kills empires. It's never the defeat you expect. Selim II. Suleiman's surviving son. Cyprus is taken in 1571, the fleet is destroyed at Lepanto the same year, and then rebuilt at astonishing speed. But the government is effectively run by the Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, not by the Sultan, and Selim himself does not campaign. D tier. Here's what actually happened in his reign that outlasts him. The Sultan stopped being the working head of state and became the owner of the state. Everything after this is downstream of that. Murad III. 21 years, a long eastern war with Persia that gains ground and then can't hold it. A serious debasement of the coinage in 1585 that triggers inflation and pay riots among the Janissaries. He never once left the capital on campaign. D-tier Mehmed III wins a major battle at Hasova in 1596. Also began his reign by executing 19 of his brothers under the fratricide law I told you to remember, the largest single application of it in the family's history. And during his reign, the Celali revolts tear through Anatolia. D-tier Ahmed I, C-tier, and this is a more interesting reign than people give it credit for. He builds the Blue Mosque. He signs the Treaty of Zitvatarok in 1606, in which the Ottoman state recognizes the Habsburg ruler as an equal rather than a tributary, a quiet, enormous admission. And he ends the practice of fratricide, replacing it with confinement of princes in the palace apartments known as the cafes, the cage. That sounds humane, hold that thought. Mustafa I, Ahmed's brother and the first product of that new system. He came to the throne having spent years in confinement, was clearly unwell, was deposed, restored, and deposed again. N.A. He was not a ruler. He was a man used as one Osman II. 17 years old, sharp, ambitious, and he understood that the Janissary Corps had become a political faction rather than an army. He tried to reform it. In 1622, the Janissaries seized him and killed him. The first Ottoman Sultan murdered by his own soldiers. D tier for the reign, but personally of everyone on this list, he might be the one I feel worst for. He diagnosed the disease correctly, and it killed him. Murad IV comes to the throne at 11, with his mother Kosum Sultan effectively governing, grows into the most feared ruler the family had produced in a century. He restored central authority by force, imposed harsh public order laws, including bans on tobacco and coffee houses, and in 1638 he retook Baghdad. The treaty that followed in 1639 fixed a border between the Ottoman and Persian worlds that is close to the Iraq-Iran line on the map today. B tier, effective and brutal in ways that were controversial in his own time, not just ours. Ibrahim F tier. His reign gave the empire the beginning of a 24-year war over Crete, escalating fiscal chaos and an increasingly ungovernable court, and he was deposed and killed in 1648. There is a real and uncomfortable question underneath this reign about what a lifetime of confinement in the cage does to a person before he is handed absolute power. But the reign itself is F. Mehmed IV. 39 years on the throne, which sounds like stability, and mostly wasn't his doing. The Koprulu Grand Viziers, Mehmed Pasha and his son Fazil Ahmed, actually run the state and run it well for a stretch. Crete finally falls in 1669. And then in 1683, the empire throws everything at Vienna a second time and loses catastrophically, and the counterattack does not stop. He was deposed in 1687, D tier. Then comes what I'd call the Karlowitz generation, Suleiman II, Ahmed II, and Mustafa II. I'm putting all three in D. Not because they were fools, but because the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 is the moment the empire formally signs away large territories, including Hungary, and everyone in Europe reads the signature. Before Karlowitz, the Ottomans lose battles. After Karlowitz, the Ottomans lose land in writing. Ahmed III. C tier. The Tulip era, cultural flowering, diplomatic missions to Europe, and the first Ottoman Turkish printing press under Ibrahim Mutafarika in the 1720s, also mounting military failure and a revolt in 1730 that removed him. Mahmud I, also C, the 1739 treaty, actually recovered Belgrade, which is a genuine win and one of the last ones. Osman III, D, a short reign by a man who had spent decades in confinement. Mustafa III, C, he tried to modernize the artillery and founded technical schools, then walked into a war with Russia in 1768 that went catastrophically. Abdul Hamid I, D, he inherits that war's consequences, and Crimea is lost in 1783, the first large Muslim-majority territory permanently torn away, Selim III. C tier, and another one I have real sympathy for. He builds a new model army, the Nizam-e-Sedid, trained on European lines, precisely because he can see the trajectory. The Janissaries and their allies deposed him in 1807, and in 1808 he was killed, two sultans now, killed by the army that was supposed to protect them for the same reason. Mustafa IV. F. His brief reign exists mainly as the instrument of that killing, and he was removed and executed within a year. Mahmud II. Atir. He watched Selim die, he learned the exact lesson, and in 1826, after years of patient preparation, he destroyed the Janissary Corps outright in the events the state called the Auspicious Incident. Then he rebuilt the army, the bureaucracy, the tax system, and the postal service, and he began the process that turns a medieval empire into a modern state. He also presided over enormous losses, Greek independence, the crushing of the fleet at Navarino in 1827, war with Russia, and Mehmed Ali of Egypt's forces marching on Anatolia. Atir anyway, because he did the one thing none of his predecessors could. He broke the faction that had been killing sultans for 200 years. Abdülmecid I C-tier, the Tanzimat reform edicts, legal equality proclaimed for non-Muslim subjects, the Crimean War fought alongside Britain and France, and the beginning of the foreign borrowing that will eventually own the empire. Abdulaziz, D-tier, a large naval building program, the first sultan to travel to Western Europe, and a state default in 1875 that led directly to his deposition in 1876 and his death days later under circumstances still argued about. Murad V, 93 days, removed on grounds of ill health, N. Abdülhamid II, C-tier, and this is the most contested placement on the list. 33 years. He allowed the first Ottoman constitution in 1876 and then suspended parliament in 1878 and ruled personally. He built the Hejaz Railway, expanded schools and telegraph lines, and modernized administration. He also ran an extensive censorship and surveillance apparatus, and his reign includes the mass killings of Armenian subjects in the mid-1890s, in which very large numbers of people died. Both of those things are the same reign. He held a collapsing empire together for 3 decades through diplomacy and control, and the methods included atrocities. C-tier is not praise. It's the honest average of a reign that cannot be summarized in one direction. Mehmed V, D-tier, and barely that. He was restored to a constitutional role after the Young Turk Revolution of 1908 and the removal of his brother in 1909, and from that point real power sat with the Committee of Union and Progress. The empire entered the First World War in 1914 under that government's decision. During that war, the Armenian population of Anatolia was subjected to mass deportation and killing, an event recognized by many states and by the great majority of historians as a genocide. The Sultan was a figurehead. The state he nominally headed was not. He died in 1918 before the end. Mehmed VI, Vahdettin, F-tier, and the last man to hold the title. He inherits a defeated empire. Allied troops occupy Istanbul. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 would have dismembered what remained. He gambles everything on cooperating with the occupying powers, believing that resistance means annihilation, while in Anatolia a national movement under Mustafa Kemal fights and wins a war of independence. On the 1st of November 1922, the Grand National Assembly abolished the Sultanate. 16 days later, the 36th and final Ottoman Sultan left his own capital on a British warship. He died in San Remo, Italy, in 1926. His creditors reportedly moved on his belongings before he could even be buried, and it took time to arrange for his body to be taken to Damascus. 6 centuries end with an unpaid bill in a rented Italian villa. And now the name I asked you to remember. Abdülmecid II. N.A. because he was never a sultan, and this is the part most people get wrong. When the Sultanate was abolished, the assembly kept the caliphate as a religious office and elected Abdülmecid, a cousin, to hold it. A painter, a cellist, a cultured man given a title with no state attached to it. He held it for 16 months. On the 3rd of March 1924, the caliphate was abolished too, and then came the order that this channel exists to talk about. Every member of the House of Osman, men, women, children, the elderly, people who had never held any office at all, was stripped of citizenship and expelled from the country within days. Some left on the Orient Express with a suitcase and a sum of money. Palaces became museums and schools. Names were removed from registers. A dynasty of 623 years was legally dissolved in a single week. What happened to them afterward is, to me, the most human part of the whole story. Abdülmecid II died in Paris in 1944 during the German occupation and could not be buried in Turkey. He was eventually interred in Medina. Princes who had grown up in palaces worked ordinary jobs across Europe and the Middle East. Female members of the family were permitted to return in the early 1950s. The men had to wait until the mid-1970s, more than half a century after they were put on the trains. And Ertuğrul Osman, born in Istanbul in 1912, grandson of a sultan, the man who would have been sultan had the empire survived, spent decades living quietly in a walk-up apartment above a restaurant in New York City. When he was finally invited back to Turkey as a private citizen, he took a public tour of Dolmabahce Palace, the building he had played in as a small boy, and paid the entrance fee like everyone else. He died in Istanbul in 2009, at 97, and was buried there. Today the head of the family is Harun Osman, born in 1932, a private man who has spent his life well outside politics. So that's the list. Osman Orhan Murad I, Murad II, and Mahmud II in A, Mehmed II, Selim I, and Suleiman in S. And an F tier that ends with a man watching his capital shrink behind a British warship. Tell me what I got wrong, because I know I did. I know some of you will not accept Bayezid I in D, and I know Abdul Hamid II at C will start an argument in the comments all by itself. Tell me where you'd move them and why. And if you want the next chapter of this, what happened inside those exiled households, decade by decade, generation by generation, that story is on this channel too. Thanks for watching.